Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this rather special event for the Lockdown LitFest, where I am delighted to introduce you to an extraordinary man. I would say that he's a Canadian writer of fantasy fiction. However, Guy Gavriel Kay would prefer not to be categorized in a specific genre as a work of in writing in historical fiction and so on. However, the majority of his novels take place in fictional settings that resemble real places during real historical periods, such as Constantinople during the reign of Justinian I, or Spain during the time of El Cid. But then an extraordinary thing happened. In 1984, he wrote his first fantasy work, entitled The Summer Tree. It became the first volume of what was an extraordinarily popular trilogy called the Fionnevar Tapestry. He's won awards aplenty, accolades aplenty, and readers and fans right around the world. And it gives me enormous pleasure to say, welcome to the Lockdown LitFest, Guy Gavriel Kay. How very, very nice to see you, Guy. How are you, first of all?
I'm very well, Paul, or as very well as we can all be in fraught times and places right now. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's lovely to see you properly. Just so the audience knows, because we're fooling nobody with our lovely virtual studio, although we like to seduce them into thinking that we're in the same room. I am locked down in the heartland of Great Britain, in the middle of rural Warwickshire. Where do we find you today?
I'm locked down in the middle of Toronto, Paul, so I think you beat me on the scenery front.
Oh, I don't know. Toronto is rather a beautiful city. Can we start, because you've had an extraordinary career. I know you took a law degree at the University of Toronto and that you were called to the bar in Ontario in 1981. But if memory serves, before that, you had something of an interest, a fascination, and a role in a writing capacity, in a storytelling capacity before then. Can we come to the young Guy Gavriel Kay? Were you a keen reader as a small boy? Did you have an inspirational teacher, a parent that read bedtime stories to you? Where did the love of story and fascination for character and narrative come from?
It's one of those things where you feel lucky or blessed all your life, Paul. I grew up in a bookish family, and it remains to this day something I regard as a gift. Both my parents were readers. My maternal grandmother, an extraordinary woman, had to leave school at about 12 or 13 because in that generation, that was the norm for an oldest daughter in a family with no money, and she was responsible for helping her mother with the smaller children. And yet, by the time I was born, by the time I was looking at books, she was one of the best read people I knew, Paul. Wow. She willed me her library when she died. She used to say that she had no time for books that weren't good. She was constantly reading The Russian Master. She read Kafka. This is an uneducated grandmother who came to North America through the Vienna woods before the First World War. And so I grew up in a family that valued, even exalted, reading and books and storytelling. And I was a precocious reader, so that I think I just turned 6 when my school teacher sent a note home to my mother over the Christmas break saying, Guy is ready to read Little Women. And my mother raised her eyebrows, which she was and remains good at doing, but dutifully went off and got me Little Women, which I devoured, and moved on to Little Men over that Christmas break. And I've never looked back. So I very much give credit and appreciation to the environment in which I grew up. Books were always being talked about, shared. This was a milieu that shaped me.
And whereabouts was this, Guy?
I grew up in Winnipeg in central Canada. It's north of Minneapolis. It's in Canadian lore. Winnipeg boasts, probably inappropriately, that it's the Paris of the prairies. I think you're allowed to note hyperbole in that one. but it played the same role in the development of Canada that Chicago did in the United States.
Yeah.
It was the railway conduit for grain and other farming materials from the breadbasket of the prairies heading east. And it was equally the conduit for manufactured goods coming west from Toronto and Montreal. It played the same role. It's always been a city, just another part of your first question, it's always been a city that punched above its weight, Paul, in cultural terms. For a city of about 500,000 people, it had an opera house, a ballet company, 2 theater companies, 2 universities, a superb art gallery. These were all things that were part of my childhood environment. It was a city large enough and cultured enough to whet the appetite, to open up an awareness in a young person of what might be out there. And so I'm actually grateful for that too. It was a splendid place to grow up if you leave aside, as you must leave aside, the winters.
Yes, quite. It sounds like an extraordinary bunch of ingredients, the 2 vital ingredients, an inspirational and bookish relation in the family, a house full of books, and a very cultured city in which to grow up as a teenager. It's the most magical bunch of ingredients for any putative writer, I would imagine.
It created a hunger, Paul. And I've talked to other people from that city, from the prairies here in Toronto now, where the cultural center of the country is. People might argue that, but it probably is. Winnipeg and the prairies bred people with an appetite and a hunger for more and a degree of industriousness, that prairie energy to come east and do what they did. There was a phrase for years in the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, our equivalent of the BBC, where they would talk about the Winnipeg Mafia running the corporation. And it was a phrase with more than a grain of truth, Paul.
Well, I know that you ended up working as an associate producer and I think a principal writer for the Canadian Broadcast Corporation radio series later in your career. Can we come back to earlier in your career? If I've done my research correctly, I understand that you were a student of philosophy at the University of Manitoba. And around this time, early mid-70s, you received an extraordinary invitation which took you to a very different place entirely. Is that correct?
That's correct. By one of those coincidences or connections that can have, as you put it, an extraordinary impact on a life and career. My father, a surgeon, was a colleague of the father of Christopher Tolkien's second wife. She was a Canadian who had been in Oxford. They met and married. And I had come to know him very slightly. The phrase I often use is about as well as a Canadian undergraduate and an Oxford Don are going to get on. But when his father, J.R.R. Tolkien, died in the winter of 73, Christopher was named literary executor.
Yeah.
And knew for the producing of what would be the Silmarillion, the first and most important by a lot of the posthumously published Tolkien materials.
Yes. And
it was a colossal responsibility, burden, both empirically and psychologically. And he wanted help. He did not want another fully fledged academic of his own age. He was 50 at the time. And the original conception of the project was very much on the model of academic research papers and books, which is to say a senior scholar and eager, bright, young students, undergrads or graduate, working with them. And that was his initial conception of how the Silmarillion would unfold. And because of the family connection, because the trust element, I think, because this was going to involve reading Tolkien Sr.'s letters, journals, diaries, notes in the newspaper over breakfast. there was a great deal of not strictly literary materials that would have to be read or inevitably be read. And the trust factor, as well as that academic model, was what induced him to suggest to, I suppose, a bright young student that perhaps I might want to spend the year working with him on it. And as I've always said, Paul, I thought it over for about 2 long seconds.
Was it a pleasure? I mean, of course, we have to remind people watching this now that unfortunately, we lost Christopher in January this year. He'd been living for a long time in his home in Draguignan in the south of France. So I would imagine it's an appalling start to the year for you. But do you have fond memories of that time working so closely with Christopher, working on J.R.R. Tolkien's papers? And what an extraordinary immersion into the world of literature and scholarly literature at that.
Paul, it was an immersion into several different things. It's a seminal year in my life. Obviously, as you say, the immersion into the Tolkien materials themselves. Yeah. It was, for an urbanized young Canadian, an immersion into the British countryside. The book was done in a small village called West Henny, not far from Wantage and Abingdon, west of Oxford. The house at the very edge of the village, walking out of the barn where we did the work, I would end up in the fields. I'd cut across the fields to Lyford Grange with a walking stick, and Lyford Grange is where Thomas Campion hid in the reign of Elizabeth when he was taken out of the priest hole, brought back to London and executed. That was another immersion for me, Paul. That was an immersion in a countryside that I hadn't experienced. And the third immersion was that the evenings, when I wasn't behaving shamelessly with beer in the local pubs, the evenings were my own writing, the beginnings of my own writing. At that time, it was poetry, Paul. My first published work, my first awards were for poetry. And it's quiet and dark and winter in the Oxfordshire countryside. And I was working a lot at night. And that third immersion was into the realization that what I would like to do was be a writer, not a philosophy professor or a lawyer, which had been the 2 top cards in the deck, as it were, before I went overseas. So it was an immersion in multiple ways of enormous importance in my own life story.
We'll come to where that writing took you in a second. May I ask just one last question on the Tolkien years? What was Christopher like to work with? Did he become a friend? Was this an easy working relationship? It strikes me it could have been rife with difficulties and jealousies and so on. And I also have to ask, I should have asked you already, Guy, had you been a fan of Tolkien's work, his father's work beforehand?
Of course I had. The invitation would never have been reasonable or legitimate if I wasn't one of those young people of my generation who had discovered Middle-earth young and admired work enormously. Paul, I've spent now, it's a long way back, I've spent decades not discussing the mechanics of the editing process. I'd made a promise as much to J.R.R. Tolkien as to C.J.R. Tolkien that I wouldn't discuss the details. I'll say that the working year was fruitful and rewarding and intense, that the time we spent together putting the Silmarillion into a finished form was one of my own best memories of a shared project. As you probably know, as you certainly know, the writing exercise is a solitary task.
Yeah.
It's one that you need to have an affinity for that kind of lifestyle, sitting down every morning with a notebook or a laptop or a mallet and chisel, if you're old enough, and and producing words by yourself.
Yeah.
And so collaborative ventures in the writing world, for me, have been few and far between. I had that year. I had some wonderful years, you hinted at it, working on The Scales of Justice, the radio and then television drama series, with two very brilliant men. Those are about the only shared creative exercises I've been. Everything else is sitting by yourself, feeling not quite as smart as you need to be.
Thank you. It was a difficult question to ask. Thank you for your very kind answer, Guy. Let's skip forward to the 80s then. So a lot of collaborative work as principal writer, associate producer for CBC, Scales of Justice, as you said. Can we come to the real grunt work of writing now? You said you'd written poetry, but what led to the writing of The Summer Tree? Did you intend this to be your launching yourself on the world as an author of fantasy? What was the germ of the idea that became this book and then a huge trilogy? Can you talk us through that?
There's one of the things I always warn people is that you need to be exceptionally careful when a writer tells you what he or she was doing, especially if it's decades ago, sometimes even if it's months ago. There's a reconstruction process. I'm fascinated by memory, and I'm fascinated by the way we shape narratives of our own lives. So I always throw caveats out, like strewing roses in front of a bride coming down the aisle before I answer a question like this. While I was in law school, Paul, I swore an oath to myself, like Lars Porsena of Clusium swearing to the nine gods, that before I accepted a fate of practicing law, it would have been criminal law. That was always what stimulated me. I would take a year and see if I could write a novel, see if I had a book in me. And I could have said, I'm going to take a year off and I'm going to travel in Europe and I'm going to discover all the wines on the continent and as many of the women on the continent as are willing to be discovered and travel. And I might write some poems or short stories. Instead, I told everyone, Paul, I told bus drivers that I'm going to Greece to get a typewriter and I'm going to come back with the novel. And I blackmailed myself because if I didn't, I had failed and I had announced it. So I did that. I flew over at the end of law school to Athens and I bought a battered, old, enormously heavy German typewriter in the flea market in Athens. And I carried it on the ferry to Crete. And I ended up in a fishing village on the south coast of Crete called Agia Galini, which is deeply, deeply important to me in my own construction of my own narrative. Right. And I wrote a book that was never published, Paul. I wrote a book about backpacking through Europe, my generation, called The Grand Tour. And it involved young protagonists doing exactly that. And I did come back with it, and I showed all the bus drivers in Toronto that I'd written a book. We had many a beer in celebration, and I had an agent. I found an agent largely because I was known in the literary world because of the Silmarillion work. I certainly wasn't known to the general public, but the book world knew who I was. And my agent sent that manuscript off to several very distinguished publishers, mostly in New York. And I'm not saying this to be wry or ironic, I got the most wonderful rejection letters. I got extraordinarily generous letters. I was 24 years old. I got the most extraordinarily generous letters from senior editors of distinguished houses saying, this is very promising, very interesting. We don't think we can make money publishing it, but we'd very much like to see the next thing that Mr. Kay does. And the next thing that Kay did was Begin the Summer Tree.
Wow.
And I began it in Toronto. I wrote the first 7 chapters here, and that same agent sent it off to London, New York, and Toronto. And I received offers for a full trilogy based on the 7 chapters.
Good Lord.
So I don't want to mislead, especially younger writers, not lucrative offers.
Okay.
I got modest offers, but they were international, and I was really young. So I had these offers, and I had 7 chapters, and I did the only practical, pragmatic thing one could do, is I told all the bus drivers I was going back to the village in Crete. And I did. I went back to Crete, and I finished The Summer Tree in the same village. It was 3 years later, some of the people in the restaurants and cafes remembered me, which warmed the cockles of my heart. And
Nice.
I was very diligent and very disciplined, and I finished The Summer Tree. And while that was being edited and a cover was being designed, I recklessly got married, and my wife and I went to the North Island of New Zealand, and I wrote The Wandering Fire, the 2nd volume of the trilogy, there. And then The Darkest Road, in my time of great and dismal suffering, I had to write in Toronto. So I allowed myself the first Macintosh computer, the 2nd Macintosh computer in that first year ever made, the one that people wore with backpacks.
Yes.
And I wrote The Darkest Road on a computer. The first books had all been written longhand with a fountain pen and a notebook. That's
Right.
how old I am, Paul.
I still write with a fountain pen and a notebook, believe you me. That's not about age. That's not about age, that's about style. 3 parts of to the tapestry to say. The Summer Tree was the first, The Wandering Fire second, The Darkest Road sort of concludes the trilogy. It won the 1987 Prix Aurora Award. The 2 questions I really have for you, Guy, is what did the award mean to you, given the struggles you got to get to that part? And what did the number of readers who really took to that trilogy in their droves, what did that mean to you as a writer?
I think, Paul, I'm going to come at it obliquely and say that the thing that meant most to me in those early years, when I was making my living writing and directing and radio and then television, the books were just getting untracked. The thing that meant most to me in those early years was translations.
Right.
The international response. The Björnvar ended up being translated, in some cases fairly quickly, into many different languages. And the sense of ratification, if I could put it that way, of validation that came from realizing that readers all around the world found something to speak to them in that trilogy is what was most rewarding. Not any single specific genre award. There were and there have been a number of awards of different kinds, as you so kindly mentioned. But for me, it has mostly been about reader responses internationally. The books are now, I'm very lucky, I'm very aware of how lucky I am when I say this. The books are now in over 30 languages.
Yeah.
So that is, as you look back, and I'm now at that age, as you look back on a career of doing this, the sense that if part of why we make art is to share and communicate, have that back and forth with other people, most of the time people we will never know. If that is part of what the artistic impulse is, then the international response has been at the heart of my own sense of having been very fortunate.
It strikes me you do a number of things that I've never seen anybody do as well as you. And as I said in my introduction, you write, when you're writing the fantasy, I'm calling them fantasy fiction, for want of a better phrase, I mean no disrespect in calling them that, but they are set, as I said, in real world places and in real times of history. So Tigana was based in Renaissance Italy. A Song for Arbonne was in the heart of the Albigensian Crusade in medieval Provence. There was the Lions of Al-Rassan, I think, in medieval Spain. Sarantine Mosaic, Byzantium of Justinian I. The question I'm building up to is, what is it about a real piece of history, something that we know about, in a real place that we can go and visit, that allows you to inject these extraordinary fictive worlds, like the fictive world of Fionnevar, back to the Fionnevar tapestry? How can you explain, can you give us any enlightenment into how that works, what the trigger, what the catalyst is for that?
Do you want to open a couple of bottles of wine and we can just keep going all day on this, Paul?
Nothing would give me greater pleasure, but let's say we've got 5 minutes.
I'll do it as fast as I can. With an awareness that brevity is often not the soul of wit, but it's the source of confusion.
Lovely quote.
When I finished the Fionnevar tapestry, which you described accurately as a down the center of high fantasy, it is a heroic fantasy trilogy.
Right, okay.
I felt that I didn't want to write what I call the fourth volume of the trilogy. There was a certain amount of pressure to do that, but I didn't want to stay in the same vein, especially because I was young. I didn't want to be locked into a form, a genre, a way of writing. And my own impulses, my own interests have always been towards history. History was always what I read when I was young, fiction and then nonfiction as I got older. The migration towards deploying elements of the fantastic to explore themes, motifs, young periods of history became for me a natural segue, a direction that fit with my own interests. And there's another element to this. This is why we need the 2 bottles of wine. The other element is I have long had a personal disquiet with pretending that I know the marital relationship of Justinian and Theodora.
Right.
That I understand the innermost thoughts of Spain's greatest national hero, El Cid. The quarter turn to the fantastic, which one clever critic used to describe what I do, history with a quarter turn. That is what frees me artistically to create the most intense and engaging characters that I can, inspired by, but not identical to, the real people. I am not pretending that I know what these people were really like. The reader and I share right out the chute, right from the beginning of the book, an awareness that we're not actually in Renaissance Florence. We are in a setting that evokes and is inspired by that. And my characters, my invented characters, evoke and are inspired by the real ones. But I am not taking on the presumption, and for me, even the morally questionable stance of working with real lives, actual lived lives, and doing with them what I want. And I want to be precise about this because I get in trouble, Paul. You don't want me to get in trouble.
I do not want you to get in trouble.
The way I can get in trouble is if this carries the suggestion that I disapprove when other writers do this. I have read with vast admiration Hilary Mantel's Thomas Cromwell trilogy. I've reviewed 2 of them here. I gave Bring Up the Bodies the best review probably I've ever given a book in print anywhere. But I still have that for me personally, that slight question mark red flag about co-opting or taking over the innermost thoughts of a real person as a writer, not as a reader.
Okay.
So my own creativity finds its wellspring in being anchored in real events, real times, real places. But that quarter turn is where I find the moral and artistic liberty, if you will, to make up my stories.
That's beautifully described, Guy. I've got a handle on it now. I have one last question in this, which again I flagged up sort of in the introduction. I understand that you rail against the phrase historical fantasy. Can you explain why that term of all terms jars with you?
It doesn't so much jar with me, Paul. Every label bothers me.
Okay, that I absolutely understand.
We are a categorizing species. In many instances, with flora and fauna, it serves enormous good. But when we're categorizing books, television, film, when we're identifying a film as The Godfather married to The Graduate, what we're doing is meant to be useful. It's meant to tell our friend, our interlocutor, this is the kind of book or film it is. The problem is that some works don't slot neatly.
Quite.
And for better or worse, and I'm going to say for better because I come back to this, how fortunate I feel I've been. I've always been challenging in terms of categories. I'm not fantastical enough for the true believer in fantasy literature, and I'm not historical enough for someone who wants to learn the details of the Treaty of Utrecht.
Yes.
You might, from me, learn a lot about the nuances and motifs of a given time and place, but you won't learn nuts and bolts details.
Okay.
And because of the associations with fantasy and history, you end up with question marks on the literary side.
Yes.
So you might say that if there's a crack to fall through, I have sought it out assiduously and found it.
Well, you say that, Guy, but readers, I know many readers of your work who sort of put you in the same group for weird reasons as Ursula Le Guin. Not because you write like Ursula Le Guin or she writes like you, but you're both sort of indefinable, is what they generally mean. Are you happy to be in such a bag?
That is company of an exalted nature. One is never anything but honored with comparisons to writers one admires. And Le Guin is certainly one that I admire. The issue is, we come back to this, what is the reason for framing one artist in terms of another?
Yeah,
and
right.
Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's like it's spot on. We know exactly that they're working in the same part of the forest or tilling the same soil. Sometimes it's a kind of desperate attempt with an artist who is sui generis to say, well, she's kind of like so-and-so if you like so-and-so.
Yes.
And that's an honorable desire. If we love a writer, it's an honorable desire to turn to our friends, our fiancés, our parents and children, and say, this person is really good and she's somewhat like so-and-so who I know you like. There's a trap there, Paul. The trap there is that if they're not really like so-and-so, that's a trap. We don't have enough bottles of wine left, but that's a trap in book covers too.
Absolutely.
The marketing of books is often to put a cover on the book that evokes an association with the previous bestseller by somebody.
Absolutely.
And the innocent buyer who picks up the book because of that linkage and cover might start reading and say, wait a minute, I've been conned. Where they might have actually loved the book if they bought it outright for what it was, rather than for a false analogy to something else.
May we be spared the lazy shorthand of comparisons and ill-advised book covers. Although I have to say, your original cover illustrations, was it Martin Springett, who they were by, were absolutely beautiful, and I think are rapidly becoming collector's items in their own right, if memory serves. They are absolutely stunning. Let's come to your latest work, because I fear the passage of time will beat us otherwise. So you wrote a book called Children of Earth and Sky in 2016, which took place in the same sort of world as the Lions of Al Rashan, which I mentioned earlier on, sort of medieval Spain. Your latest work is A Brightness Long Ago, and I've not had a copy, so I'm shooting in the dark, and I do apologize for that, guy. I don't know why I keep saying guy. It's a prequel to A Children of Earth and Sky. So the latest one is A Brightness Long Ago, and it's a prequel to Children of Earth and Sky. Is that correct?
It takes place before, but it doesn't function as a prequel. All it is another novel that works with different settings and motifs of 15th century Europe. That's my preferred way to frame it. The overlap of actual characters and events is very limited.
Right, okay.
The overlap of setting is real. It takes place about 25 years before the earlier book, because I found that I had a great many things that I still wanted to say and explore in that Renaissance setting. And frankly, Paul, if you don't find things to say and explore in 15th century Italy, there's something wrong with you.
Exactly. And you set this beautifully in Italy, Istanbul, and the Balkans. You travel around a lot in this book.
Yeah. For writing it or in the setting of the book itself?
Well, in the setting of the book itself. But what I do want to ask you is, how did you go about researching it? Do you have to know the place in order to evoke the sense of place?
I have done that. I don't have to do that. And in some instances, it can almost be a negative. If you go right now to China, the evidence of Tang Dynasty China, around which I wrote my novel Under Heaven, is limited. I did go, but I went between my two books inspired by China. There's no necessity at this stage in my life for being in the place of the book I'm writing. There is a wonderful upside, and I don't need to spell this out for you, but if you're writing a book about Tuscany, there's a lot to be said for being in a Tuscan farmhouse while you're writing it. And I've been lucky enough to do that.
I know.
But I don't feel that it is, at this point, Paul, there aren't many really good things about getting older, Paul. But one of them is that you learn your own processes, your own methods, the way you get things done, and you get more confidence in yourself that you can get them done. Yeah. When I was starting out, I used to go away. I've written 4 books in the south of France. And one of the reasons I went away was because I wanted to take myself away from friends, family, distraction, the quotidian demands of life, and put myself in a place where all I was focusing on when I woke up was the 1,000 to 1,500 words I wanted to write that day. Yeah. After which, if I'd gotten them written, there were vineyards not far away. But the writing had to come first. And the point I'm making is that as you get older, you don't necessarily need that withdrawal, that retreat, that isolation, although it's ironic because right now we are all isolated and I'm writing steadily because that's what I do now. That's my point. That Yeats put it, nothing comes more easily to my hand than this accustomed toil. That's where you end up when you get older as an artist. And you might not feel any more sure that a given work is good, but you know that you can do your work. And that's where I've arrived. I can do my work. I could sit down, and I do sit down to write.
I'm liking hearing you talk about process. Can I bring us back a little bit to Mr. Tolkien? Having worked on J.R.R. Tolkien's papers with Silmarillion, did that teach you anything about process that has endured? Did you learn any lessons, any enduring lessons that you've applied to your own writing?
I think many, and some of them are so internalized that I haven't even pushed them forward to formulate them as a logical thought. A couple of them were, and I knew this then, I was lucky enough, young, to see from the papers and materials how many false starts J.R.R. Tolkien had, how many flawed drafts, misconceptions, scribbled notes on the order of this doesn't work. He didn't frame it that way, but that was his sense. And then after another draft and another draft and another rethinking, something that works wonderfully well emerged. And I was lucky enough, before I was writing my own books, to have internalized that, which is to say that works of art, whether great or just competent, don't spring full blown like Athena from the brow of Zeus into existence. There are labors and errors and struggles, and in my case, a fair bit of brooding and swearing before that emerges. And I did take that away from my year working on the Tolkien materials. And I think the other thing, and I don't think anyone has ever been able to sustain it the way Tolkien did, is the value of taking your time.
Right.
Now, there's a caveat here. Time is a luxury for artists. It's more of a luxury in some ways in the last few years than it's ever been, because the younger writers across the spectrum of literature are increasingly under pressure to try to do a book every year or two at most, or they will be forgotten figures, roadkill on the highway of art, because the pressure to produce quickly is in many ways, Paul, greater than the pressure to produce well. That's the society we have right now.
Yeah.
And I was steeped really young, before I was even writing myself. I was steeped in the opposite sense, that if you wanted to be any good, if your aspiration is to do as well as you can, whatever the ceiling for that is, then taking your time, rewriting, thinking it through, are invaluable to the artistic process. I'm jealous of the people who can get up and have 6 good ideas between brushing their teeth and the first cup of coffee. I'm not one of them. It's a slow, research-driven, note-taking, rewriting and revising exercise for me. That takes us back to what I guess we've never left, the issue of process and method. For me, that's embedded in process and method. And I think some of my comfort with that came from seeing all the Tolkien materials young.
An extraordinary start. Just very briefly, there is a huge rise in fantasy fiction, in historical fiction, a huge rise in publishing. And people used to say 10 years ago, we were having a renaissance of a golden age of crime fiction. I cannot help but feel that we have a golden age of historical fantasy, historical fiction, and fantasy fiction are looming right now. For young writers who are reading you, reading Neil Gaiman, reading all Ursula Gwynn, so many people, so many great names, who are like you, are inspired to write young, is the one piece of advice that you wish you'd had then that would serve you now, that you can offer to young writers coming up?
You are putting me in the most excruciatingly awkward position, Paul.
I'm so sorry.
Here's why. No, you're not. It just makes for a good conversation. The reason is because I am notoriously on record with my last piece on this subject was on not giving advice.
I know.
Oh, you see, I knew you knew.
I've enjoyed the conversation with you, and I'd like to have a go.
I'm impressed. Very well done. Well played, sir. The point is, I think we have entered a golden age of literary advice giving. I think between all the venues and forums out there, authors, teachers, people aspiring to either status are storming the ramparts to offer advice to the increasing number of people who want to be writers. And here's Kay with a weak sword arm standing in the doorway of the ramparts, the gateway under the portcullis, saying, wait a minute, do it the way that works best for you.
Yeah.
The main advice that I give, and it's sincere with that caveat, I'm the caveat king, Paul. I'm always giving conditionals to, I resist absolutes in art. It's chronic for me. I resist and dislike diktats when it comes to how art gets made. But the one thing I do tell all young and not so young writers is that every good writer I know is a good reader. And I believe there is such a thing as a good reader. My literary agent in the UK, Johnny Geller, Curtis Brown, actually got in trouble online a number of years ago with what I saw as a completely innocuous, you know where I'm going, correct comment that a great book deserves a great reader.
Yes.
And all he meant is that if somebody has put in the effort and the hours and the creativity to produce a great book, they deserve a commitment from you, the reader, of more than just a desultory, grazing mindset. That's all he meant. If it's a great book, bring something to it. Meet the author halfway. But he was savaged in the society we have today for the implication that it was an elitist observation. A great reader doesn't mean a reader with a PhD in comparative literature. It means a reader bringing as much of themselves to the work as they can. And my extension of Johnny's point is that one of the ways you become a better writer is by becoming a better reader. And that includes reading widely, not just in the areas, fields, genres, sub-genres that appeal to you most. You will be better as a person and better as an artist if your own range as a consumer of art is wider.
Guy, I'm indebted to you. Not only have you given great advice to authors, you've given great advice to readers. And for a man who gives no advice, I feel like I've won a small victory. I'm honored to know Johnny Geller as a friend. And I remember the incident you said, and he really took it in the neck. But it was such a well-intentioned and, in fact, quite correct comment. Guy, we have run out of time. I'm going to ask you for a personal favor, if you don't mind. Would you mind very much if we dedicate this show to the memory of Christopher Tolkien, who you worked with all those years ago, and to the memory of a young lady who is no longer with us called Hannah Frances Catherine Trett, who was an extraordinary fan of yours and who introduced me to your writing, and without whom I would not have had the honor of reading everything you've written, but also having had this extraordinary conversation with you today. Thank you so much for joining us, Guy Gavriel Kay. Hopefully, on the publication of your next book, we can have you back in a year or so's time, and maybe we can do it in the same place with a couple of bottles of wine. I hope you stay well in Toronto with your wife and your son. I know that you're safe there. Thank you so much for joining us, Guy.
Paul, thank you. It was a delightful conversation. Despite all the technical restraints, I'll be happy to do it again over a drink.
You're very kind. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to me, Paul Blazard, interviewing Guy Gavriel Kay, talking not only about the film of our tapestry and Tolkien, but his book, which is due to be coming out soon, called A Brightness Long Ago. No, sorry, it's actually out. Forgive my error. It's called A Brightness Long Ago. It's a sort of not a prequel to The Children of Earth and Sky, and they are just exquisite works. I commend them to you. As ever, from all of us at Lockdown LitFest, we hope you're well. We hope you're keeping safe. We hope you're being careful. And as ever, thank you very much for joining us. Cheerio.